Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me. My name's Matthew Richardson, and I recently co-authored a report that we published earlier this year called Spark, Partnering to Electrify in Europe. If you download these slides, you can find a link to the report below the report here. And if you have any questions, it will be my pleasure, along with my colleague, Zuzana Puchikova, who leads public policy in the EU for Uber, to answer any of your questions on the email addresses on this slide. So recently, Uber announced a package of measures around driving a green recovery following the pandemic. In Europe specifically, we made a number of promises in this report, including to switch our platform to be 50% electric across a number of key cities by 2025, as well as reporting publicly on CO2 emissions from trips on the platform and expanding green options like our Uber Green service, which includes the opportunity to have a trip in a cleaner vehicle, as well as bikes, scooters, and public transport options. We also spent a lot of time in this report talking about the policies that we believe are most conducive to supporting drivers in making this transition. These commitments built on an earlier commitment we made to be fully electric in London by 2025. And I'm glad to say that we're starting to make good progress against that goal, including over £100 million raised so far in the Clean Air Plan, which helps drivers to convert their vehicle from a combustion vehicle to a cleaner vehicle, as well as building partnerships with key players across the industry to help improve the ecosystem for electrification. At Uber, we believe that high-kilometer commercial drivers have a key role to play in this transition. That's partly because they drive a lot compared to the average consumer, so they have a big benefit when they move to an electric vehicle themselves. But they also support the transition across society as a whole by helping drive a reduction in the cost of electric vehicles and improving charging infrastructure for everybody. That said, there are real challenges that drivers face. So high-kilometer commercial drivers, which includes drivers on the Uber app, but also other kinds of drivers like delivery drivers or drivers who might provide home services driving from person's house to person's house. We think they have a key role to play, but we have to address their concerns head on. So at Uber, we work very closely with drivers to really understand what the experience is like in an electric vehicle. And the good news is that drivers are really interested in moving to an EV, even compared to the general population. On the right here, you can see a number of drivers that we call the EV ambassadors in London. And we work very closely with them to understand their experience as early adopters of an electric vehicle on the Uber app. And they in turn work with other drivers to help them understand what are the pros and cons of driving an electric vehicle and how to get started. And when we work with drivers, we find three barriers coming up again and again, similar to consumers, but with a slight difference. So the first is the lack of appropriate charging. Now, one of the key things to understand is that many drivers who drive on the Uber app don't have the same level of access to off-street parking that the average consumer may do. They may not have a driveway or a garage where they're able to install a private charger. And in this case, they have two options: charge on the street on public infrastructure, or rapid charge, in which case they spend time off the road, which potentially can reduce their earnings. Likewise, it's important to understand that many drivers' alternative to an electric vehicle is not necessarily a new combustion vehicle, but a second-hand vehicle. So the lack of affordable and second-hand electric vehicles is a key barrier to them. Given these impacts on their cost of driving, it's important that the incentives that are available are sufficient to close the gap that they might face if they move into an electric vehicle. This situation is very different market to market, but it's important to understand the total picture that a driver faces when they're considering moving into an electric vehicle. So on the charging side, the danger is that even with a long-range electric vehicle, where you can go a whole day on a single charge, if you're not able to combine those charges with the breaks you would naturally take in your day, because charging is not in an appropriate location or not easy to use or get to, then you may end up spending a good amount of time off the road where you could otherwise be on the road earning. For any business or self-employed person, this is a real challenge because it reduces the revenue that they can bring in because of the time they spend charging. In London, for instance, we believe that drivers have two options. They have an option to rapid charge, and that's a key option, which many drivers use today. But they also have the option of charging overnight, often on public infrastructure. So we built this map which looks at where drivers lived in the blue hexagons here versus where the charging infrastructure is today. And we note that independent studies have suggested that London will need 10 times more charging infrastructure in 5 years. And about 70% of that will be for drivers who use the Uber app. But the chargers today are not always in the same places where those drivers would really want them. This picture is obviously different city to city, but we think generally across Europe, it's important that charging infrastructure both expands, but also that it really is targeted on the locations where high kilometer commercial drivers live or leave their car overnight, particularly for that slower on-street overnight charging. It's important to consider the overall cost picture for a driver. So here we see the cost difference between an electric vehicle, a new combustion vehicle, and a used combustion vehicle, as well as this potential increase, what we call the opportunity cost, so the lost revenue of the extra time off the road, which can make electric vehicles less cost competitive than particularly a second-hand combustion engine vehicle. This depends a lot on the individual driver and also the policies in the market. So here you see the impact of a number of common policies across European cities on the economics that a driver would face. So for instance, the large subsidy on the cost of an electric vehicle in Paris helps close the gap, but it won't fully close the gap for a driver using rapid charging. The congestion charge fee in London, which is only paid by combustion engine vehicles rather than electric vehicles, has the opposite effect, but it also helps close the gap. And so we believe that any one of these policies individually will not actually be enough to change the underlying economics for a driver, but working together, a comprehensive package of policies can close this gap. With that in mind, I think policymakers could have some universal principles in mind. And one of them, we would suggest is thinking in terms of EV kilometers as opposed to EV ownership. It's quite common today for policies to be focused on increasing EV sales, but without regard to whether those sales are to people who drive the most or to the general population. And we believe that drivers who drive the most in an EV have a direct, better, improved impact, both in terms of their direct CO2 emissions, but also in catalyzing the market for all of us. There's also a number of other principles you can learn more about in the report. With these policies in mind, there are some particular areas that we would suggest it would be fruitful to explore. So these three barriers here can be overcome by the right policies. For example, ensuring all high mileage drivers can reliably charge overnight where they park. That has implications for how the network is planned and designed, and also the speed of the charges that are required to make sure that a high kilometer driver has enough electricity in the battery to go a whole day. It's important to stimulate the affordable and second-hand EV market, which is particularly important for these high kilometer professional drivers, both by making cheaper long-range EVs really affordable for that cohort of drivers, but also tilting them towards the drivers who drive the most and developing the second-hand market as quickly as possible, including by stimulating the primary market of fleet buyers who then help generate the secondary market quicker over time, as well as tilting the economics of everyday use with a real focus on high mileage, high kilometer drivers. So one idea is to explore fiscal policies that naturally scale on use. So the more you drive, the more you benefit. For example, on charging, cost of charging, and the cost of fuel, or by focusing fiscal support primarily on drivers who drive more than other drivers. There are also specific barriers up front for professional drivers in terms of financing. And we do think that the longer term solution may well be emissions-based road charging, which we would support. We do believe that with the right conditions in place, this change does not need to take forever. We think that drivers on the Uber app could be fully electric within 5 years if that cost gap closes. But we think that without measures to close that cost gap, the market naturally will move more slowly. So solving these issues around charging, around more affordable vehicles, and around the policy environment are crucial. But once they're in place, we believe change can happen very quickly. Thank you for listening. Please go to the website where you can download the full report. And if you have any questions, I'd be delighted to take them. Feel free to reach out to myself or Susanna on the email address on this slide. Thank you.